Thank you, Amy. I want to thank you all for coming and very grateful that you're taking part in the Frieze lecture series. This was a vision of Ruth Evelyn Katz, a great leader in our community, and I'm grateful to see that we're continuing that great tradition. And we're celebrating another tradition here with this year's season, and that is the legacy of Roald Tweet, Augustana's Conrad Bergendorf professor in the humanities. He was our first Bergendorf chair, and actually, no, he was the second, but anyway, Dorothy Parkander was the first, fittingly. And those of you who knew Tweet, not only was he the most prolific lecturer in this series, Brett, he did 6 of these over the years, but he was famously impish. And loved to start fights on campus. And now these are campus fights, so no fisticuffs. But he would get into the midst of the English faculty and say, well, you know, blank is the greatest novel ever written, knowing that that would start a fight, right? And he could argue for and against just about any novel you would care to name that was from the canon. And he engendered a lot of lively debate, and he loved that. He loved to do that. So we thought in his honor or memory, we would frame this series around best book ever, and in a moment we're going to hear, I think, a very strong case for a wonderful book that I hope you'll dive into if you haven't already. But I made a commitment to Tweet's memory that in the introduction of each, I'd tell one other little facet of Tweet's chicanery. I was describing him to a friend today. He was our campus Loki, if you know Norse mythology. Well, he was very proud of his Norwegian heritage, proselytizing as he was, bringing the light of wisdom and enlightenment to us benighted Swedes. And he was commissioned in, let's see, this would have been 1975, I think, for the 125th anniversary of the college to do a wood carving. And it was on display in our college center until just recently. You can still see it. It's a beautiful wood carving, and it shows our community with, you see the river, you see beautiful trees and forests, and an eagle there perched up in the front of the wood carving, and the inscription from Isaiah, they will mount up with wings as eagles, right? Celebrating Augustana, 1860 to 1975, or whatever, 1985, that would be the 125th. But you had to look very, very closely, and in the lower corner he had carved Syttende Mai. And if you don't know, that is Norwegian Independence Day. That was one of his pranks. The other one, if any of you have ever heard of the ship Vasa in Sweden, it was a ship that set sail and sank immediately. And they built a museum around it. And it's probably both highlight and lowlight of Swedish naval history. And he always threatened that one day he would take a telephone pole and he would drop it in our slough with a small Swedish pennant on it and call it the Vasa Memorial, because that's all that was left of the ship after it sank. But that was the kind of person that Tweet was. Not only did he engender great affection, he engendered great curiosity. And that's the spirit we take to today's lecture and the whole series. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker today. Brett Biebel teaches writing and literature at Augustana. So not only does he have an appreciation of literature as a consumer, but as a producer. And I would encourage you to look into some of his work, especially 48 Blitz. That's his debut short story collection. And if you do a little search on Brett, you can actually see a video of him reading from one of the stories in that collection. It's available from Split Lip Press. And if you need more information, I'm sure that we can get it to Amy and we can share it with you. But Brett got his undergraduate work at St. John's University, right? And you didn't want to go too far, right? You want to stick with the Minnesota theme.
That's right.
Correct. And he did his master's at University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and also has an MFA from Minnesota State University. As I'm sure you're about to discover, our students are very, very fortunate to have him in our midst. Please join me in welcoming Brett Biebel.
Thank you all very much. Good. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming, and I really appreciate having me. I never had the privilege of meeting Dr. Tweet, but From Kai's description, there are some similarities to Thomas Pynchon in terms of the impishness, particularly. Pynchon won the National Book Award for 1973's Gravity's Rainbow. And that was after the Pulitzer Prize committee decided not to, they didn't give an award that year. They said the Gravity's Rainbow was too obscene, so didn't give the award. He gets the award for National Book Award 1973, and instead of going to give an acceptance speech, he sends a stand-up comedian in his place, a guy by the name of Erwin Corey. So you can actually still find that speech if you look around. So Pynchon is someone who I love to talk about because he just gives you so much to talk about. He is certainly a writer of cult status, where the people who love Pynchon really love Pynchon. Is anybody familiar with Pynchon generally? Is anybody familiar with Pynchon? Okay, a little bit, yeah. For those who aren't, I want to play this little clip from CNN. It's like a CNN story from 1997, the year that Mason and Dixon came out. That's the book I'm going to talk about. And it gives you a nice rundown of sort of the myths around Pynchon. And it's always fun because I play this for my students, and they're like, the graphics are so old, right? It's like how I feel when I look at like World War I film. But it always feels fresh to me. So here's the clip, and that will provide some nice context.
Star Greg Garbo withdrew from public life. She was quoted as saying, "I want to be alone." One of the 20th century's most respected novelists says even less. Many of his fans don't even know what he looks like. CNN's Charles Feldman tries to pierce the mystery of Thomas Pynchon.
In 1953, Dwight Eisenhower was in the White House. Thomas Pynchon was a senior at Oyster Bay High on Long Island, New York. Today, his fifth novel is on the New York, Los Angeles Times bestsellers lists. It is thick, Words and Complexity. Its mere publication was considered a stellar literary event.
I would rate Thomas Pynchon, as do most critics these days, right at the very top.
While Pynchon's books can be found side by side with other works of popular fiction, you won't find Pynchon the author anywhere. The last known photographs of Pynchon date all the way back to the early 50s.
No one had seen this man ever. No reporter had found him in, I think, something like 40 years.
In fact, until Nancy Jo Sales of New York Magazine tracked Pynchon down to a Manhattan neighborhood last year, some fans wondered whether Pynchon even existed. In cyberspace, Pynchon is a popular topic of discussion. Until the arrest last year of Theodore Kaczynski, some fans thought Pynchon was the Unabomber. Others speculated he was actually several people writing under a pseudonym.
I think the mystery helps a lot. The fact that there is, that creates its own publicity because nobody knows who he is, so people talk about who he might be.
But Pynchon has been somewhat coy and even playful about his anonymity.
Did you happen to see a guy come in my office? He quit today, a little white hair, 60-ish.
When the now canceled John Larroquette TV show started making highbrow references to Pynchon, the writer apparently started making corrections.
He wrote back through his agent making suggestions. So in a very polite way, Thomas Pynchon helped rewrite that script.
In the early 1980s, a newspaper in a small Northern California town started getting letters from a writer called Wanda Taneski. Letters widely believed by literary scholars to have been written by Thomas Pynchon and now collected in book form.
He takes some pretty hard swipes at other powerful literary figures, including Alice Walker, John Leonard, the critic. So it would be difficult for him to come forward and say, well, I wrote these letters, and then have to explain himself.
He's the Greta Garbo of literature, and this fascinates quite a few readers. Some of them have tried to seek him out. Others suspect that he's a kind of a Wizard of Oz type character behind the scenes who has access to all sorts of special knowledge.
Because of the mythology around it, fans may be disappointed to learn Pynchon leads a somewhat conventional life in New York City.
He shops at neighborhood stores, he lunches with other writers, he spends weekends in the countryside with his family.
In fact, should you pass the now 60-year-old author on a busy Manhattan sidewalk, you wouldn't even know. Through point, CNN caught up with Pynchon, and he is among the people you have been looking at. At Pynchon's request, and after much debate, CNN has opted not to point him out in the crowd. Pynchon told CNN by phone rare public comment, let me be unambiguous. I prefer not to be photographed. And as for the notion that he is a recluse, Pynchon told us, and we quote, my belief is that recluse is a code word generated by journalists, meaning doesn't like to talk to reporters. As a writer, Pynchon has total control over his fictional world. But should that control extend beyond the printed page? So far, for the most part, it has. Charles Feldman, CNN.
That's yeah. I always find the quote to be humorous. By the way, if you have questions as I'm talking, please feel free to jump in. I think one of the things I like about this clip is that it alludes to sort of the idea that there's a myth around Pynchon, but it also undercuts the myth a little bit. Because the reality is that Pynchon is married to his literary agent. His son at the time, Mason and Dixon, I think his son was 6, born in 1981. Fairly well known around in the literary circles, right? So a lot of the stuff about reclusiveness is a myth, and I think that talking about Pynchon often involves having to separate the myth from the reality. I think Pynchon, if anybody's heard of him, there's a reputation for difficulty. Writes very big, long. This is my copy of Dixon. You can see it's well loved. But big, long books, very historical. He's part of this sort of postmodern literary movement. His books are known for being complex, and there's a lot of truth to that. I think part of the reason why Pynchon gets so much attention from his fans is because he likes to have fun. A lot of his books are very funny. He combines sort of very dense historical allusions with jokes. You'll get, there's lots of puns in his work, and they're all over the place. In Inherent Vice, which they made a movie out of, there's a bar above a massage parlor called the massage parlor is called Rubies, and the bar is called The Price of Wisdom. So The Price of Wisdom is above Rubies. It's a long, obscure pun that's based on the book of Proverbs, stuff like that. Silly names. So he's got a character named Benny Profane. That's the main character of his debut novel. V, Rachel Hourglass, Roger Mexico. He actually has a real character named Mike Fallopian in the book The Crime of Lot 49. His characters will break out into song at random moments. There's a long section of Gravity's Rainbow where it's nothing but dirty limericks about the B-2 rockets that the Germans built during World War II. And so there is this combination, I think, and this is part of why I really connect to Pynchon and why I chose this book for sort of my submission for best book ever. There's a combination of deadly seriousness and deep playfulness and fun. Pynchon he's a different kind of historical novelist. He is at once very immersed in history. He cares a lot about the historical record. He loves to find obscure historical connections, whether it's the connections between the German scientists who built the B-2 rocket and then came over to America to build the rocket that took us to the moon, Werner von Braun in particular. He loves to sort of trace those things out, but he will also mix history with invention. And that's a lot of what Mason and Dixon is about, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. I look at this book as, I don't know if you've ever looked at an old photograph, like a black and white photograph, or even a portrait that's representing a different era. And I always have to remind myself when I look at those photographs that the people in them saw the world in full color, right? Like the world did not look black and white to them. And that seems obvious, but it takes an effort to sort of remind myself of that. Pynchon, I think, is applying that rubric to the 18th century in Mason and Dixon. This is a book about trying to make the 18th century as vivid and human as it possibly can to a 21st century reader. Mason and Dixon, when I say that phrase, does anybody know Mason and Dixon, who they are, what they do? Yeah! Who are they?
It was the line that divided north from south when they were surveyors.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah, Charles Mason was an astronomer primarily, but you need to calculate your longitude and latitude, which they needed to do very precisely to draw this line. They needed to look at the stars. Jeremiah Dixon was a surveyor, marking boundaries, all of those kinds of things. They worked together on several projects, but the main one is drawing the Mason-Dixon line which we come to know as dividing sort of free states from slave ones in American history. And Pynchon, in reimagining their story, he sees that line as a powerful metaphor for all of history, and in particular for American history. The 18th century, just for a little bit of historical context, was a time of rapid technological advancement. There were changes in the calendar. So the calendar as we know it today came about in the 18th century. Standardization of weights and measures. You start to have in the 18th century a sense of global commerce. And in the story of the Mason-Dixon line, one of the things that gets talked about historically is how technically precise it was and what an achievement it was. Just as an illustration, Mason and Dixon had to draw an 86-mile line north from the bottom of Delaware to the top where it meets Maryland. And that line had to hit a circle that ran around the city of Newcastle, Delaware, at one precise point. And Mason and Dixon had to draw this 86-mile line, passing, just barely grazing this one point, and then running up to Maryland. When they drew the line, they found that spot, they were off by 2 feet. Which it takes a tremendous amount of work with their instrument. I mean, it's a tremendous technological achievement. And a lot of that's happening in the 19th century. You have global goods being moved across country, shipped. I think we think of the 18th century as sort of maybe pre-technological, right? But there are ships carrying large quantities of goods, sugar, coffee, all across the country. There's the Dutch East India Company. You may have heard of the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company, they had their own army, they had their own ships. Their value, as an approximation in dollars, was $8 trillion. Just for context, Amazon is worth $2 trillion. So you've got a company that's 4 times the size of Amazon moving things across the globe. And so it's a time of massive technological advancement. On the other hand, this technological advancement is dependent on scientific data. You need to know the stars to determine longitude to prevent the loss of your ships. And it's also dependent on colonization and slavery. You don't get those markets without those 2 things. And Pynchon is very interested in exploring not the progress side of this, but the dark kind of underpinnings of this. There are critics who will say Pynchon has a paranoid conception of history, and that's sort of true. I mean, he sees history as a kind of conspiracy that's often pointed in the direction of exploitation and violence. And that certainly comes through in this book. As I said, it's deadly serious. Now, there's also a lot of fun along the way, but that's really something that he cares about a lot. One of the points of this book, and part of why I think it's so powerful, is because he treats Mason and Dixon very humanly, but he also doesn't let them off the hook. He sees them as complicit in that system. They're running these lines for the king. They're running these lines for the East India Company. And because of that, they're complicit in the sort of sins of the day. So Pynchon has a few, I think he has political purposes in writing this book. He has political projects, and he has personal projects. There are 3 political projects, and the first one is to sort of show us the subjective nature of history. At least I think that's what he would say. I think part of the reason I love this book is because it was ahead of its time. We're familiar perhaps with the 1619 Project or all sorts of discussions about how to teach history in schools. Pynchon is questioning that. Now certainly people were questioning it in 1997 when the book came out, right? But he's certainly questioning it in a New York Times bestseller in a way that's very out there and public. So here's a passage that I think gets at this. This is from the middle part of the book. Facts are but the playthings of lawyers, tops and hoops forever a spin. Alas, the historian may indulge no such idle rotating. History is not chronology, for that is left to lawyers, nor is it remembrance, for remembrance belongs to the people. History can as little pretend to the veracity of the one as claim the power of the other. Her practitioners to survive must soon learn the arts of the quidnunc, spy, and taproom wit. that there may ever continue more than one lifeline back into a past we risk each day losing our forebears in forever. Not a chain of single links, for one broken link could lose us all. Rather a great disorderly tangle of lines, long and short, weak and strong, vanishing into the mnemonic deep with only their destination in common. Pynchon's writing this book in an 18th century style. That's part of the reason he's trying to make this era feel real to us. But part of the idea of the passage is that history is always a performance. Charles Mason is writing in his journal that he knows his bosses are going to read. And that's part of our record of the expedition, that journal that he's performing in a certain way. And the reality behind that performance is inaccessible to us. Right? That there's always this kind of subjectivity to how we read history, that we can't know what really happened. We have to rely on guesswork. And so Pynchon argues that what we need is a lot of versions of history, tangle of lines, as opposed to one single line, and that we should acknowledge that. So history is always coming from one particular perspective. I think he also wants to argue that history is this sort of organization of interests. One of the themes that drives this book is the idea that the Enlightenment was a time of great scientific advance and spiritual retreat. And Pynchon sees that the sort of dawn of rationality and science as providing the gateway into exploitation and sort of the worst sins of capitalism, if you will. So that's what Pynchon is really about. And he writes about that, I think, very, very, very deeply here. He likes to find these moments where that narrative, kind of powerful interests exerting their will over a subjugated population. So the East India Company, the Royal Society, the elites, right, kind of imposing their order, their will on people of the lower classes. He likes to find these moments where that might flip. And in our usual sense, I think we would think of the American Revolution as one of those moments where the underdogs rally together to sort of achieve freedom. Pynchon doesn't buy that. He sees the American Revolution as part of the broader Enlightenment project. Here's what he writes about America in this book. Does Britannia, when she sleeps, dream? Is America her dream, in which all that cannot pass in the metropolitan wakefulness is allowed expression away in the restless slumber of these provinces, and on westward, wherever 'tis not yet mapped, nor written down, nor ever by the majority of mankind seen, serving as a very rubbish tip for subjunctive hopes, for all that may yet be true, earthly paradise, fountain of youth, Christ's kingdom ever behind the sunset, safe till the next territory to the west be seen and recorded, measured, tied back into the network of points already known that slowly triangulates its way into the continent, changing all from subjunctive to declarative, reducing possibilities to simplicities that serve the ends of governments. He sees that as part of the broader narrative, and he wants to kind of flip our perspective on that. And also explore our inability to change it. That's something that Pynchon is immersed in quite deeply, is as individuals, what can we do about any of this? I talked earlier about sort of the Dutch East India Company and the global trade of the 18th century being dependent on colonization and slavery. In the US context, it's also dependent on Indian removal, what they would call Indian people, right? Opening up the West for settlement or civilization. And Pynchon would put quotes around those words, like civilization, progress, right? He wants us to think about them in a different way. So here's there's a scene in the book where Jeremiah Dixon goes to a scene of a massacre. Some white settlers went to an Indian town. These Native Americans are being held in a cell in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. You can do a lot of research on this. It's called the Lancaster County Massacre. And they were let in by the guards, and they killed them all. And Jeremiah Dixon goes to see this. And so he's in the cell, and he said as he's thinking, I'll read what he says. He says, Yet is Dixon certain as the lightness he feels now, lightness premonitory of flying, that far worse happened here to these poor people, as the blood flew and the children cried, that at the end no one understood what they said as they died. I don't pray enough, Dixon sub-vocalizes, and I can't get upon my knees just now because too many are watching. Yet I could kneel, and would I pray, 'twould be to ask, respectfully, that this be made right, that the murderers meet appropriate fates, that I be spared the awkwardness of seeking them out myself and slaying as many as I may before they overwhelm me. Much better if that be handled some other way, by someone a bit more credible. He feels no better for this outpouring. Pynchon wants us to appreciate that, I think, or at least accept that Dixon is both complicit, just as Mason is, in all of this stuff going on around it, but in certain ways he doesn't have a lot of power to change it. And that's part of what he sees as the modern world, right? And he's grappling with that very deeply in his work. Maybe a personal example helps here. Anybody ever written to Congress? Written a letter to their senator? Did they write back? Yeah. They didn't? They did. Was it a personal letter?
No.
What did it look like?
Thank you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think, for Pynchon, and this is part of it, he has this divide in his work between the elites and the predator, right? Or what he calls the predator, the people who don't have power. And we always think the elites have the power to change it, right? But even for Pynchon, he would say that no, the real power is invisible. You can't see it. The president is driven by the imperatives of capitalism and the military-industrial complex, right? Like that would be his idea. That like if the president wanted to suddenly raise taxes to 100, to 80%, he couldn't do it, right? There are certain things that guide his approach that can't be broken away from, and that's especially true as you sort of get lower down the chain into the lower classes. And I think I relate to this. A lot of us are affiliated with institutions. So, at my job at Augustana, I can often send messages and have input in the process, right? But as Kai knows well, the process is long, and there are lots of committees involved. And it's very difficult to make that suggestion a reality. It takes a long time, if at all. And so the question is, what do we do about this? What I love about Pynchon is that I think he is realistic about the possibilities for change, and especially in this book, he's realistic about what to expect, and he's angry about the situation that the world finds itself in, but he also doesn't ever really get cynical. And I think there's a lot of humanity in this book, and that's why there's a personal project here too. And that personal project comes in two parts, and one is to remedy our lack of control with humor. So Pynchon loves to make caricatures of the people in power, and the people in charge. There's a section where Mason and Dixon go hang out with George Washington. And George Washington is usually, or Ben Franklin, who's also depicted in this book. They're usually depicted, I think, heroically. This book does not do that. So what Mason and Dixon do is they go, they hang out with George Washington, and George Washington, among other things, grew hemp. So what do? They smoke it in the book. So here they are, and as they're smoking it, Martha Washington comes in, and George Washington says, "Oh, stay calm, it's the wife. Just let me do my treasure, excellent gown, handsome stuff, allow me to present," and so forth. Mrs. Washington, "Oh, la, call me Martha, boys," is a diminutive woman with a cheerful rather than happy air, who seems to bustle even when standing still. At the moment, she is carrying an enormous tray, piled nearly beyond her angles of repose with tarts, popovers, gingerbread figures, fried pies, stuffed donuts, and other units of refreshment the surveyors fail to recognize. "Smelled that smoke, figured you'd be needing additional something to nibble on," the doughty Mrs. W. greets them. The task, as usual, fall into that age of domesticity unrelenting to life, as none of you could run a house for more than 10 minutes in the world wherein most of us must dwell without anarchy setting in. "I was supposed to be watching a pot upon the fire," sighs Washington. "Matters more immediate claim my attention, one giving rise to yet another, till a certain odor recalled me to the pot. Alas, too late, another ruinous flaw in my character, perhaps one day to be amended by me, though never to be forgiven by my lady." So you see these great figures from the American Revolution, engaging in kind of domestic spats, or engaging in behavior that we would not usually associate with them. And I think that's part of the idea here, is to kind of use humor to both humanize these figures, detach us from our sense of sort of history as this all-consuming thing written by history that's unchangeable, and give us at least a sense of power over how we depict them. It's also to show our own complicity in the system, and once we realize it, to act in small ways. So toward the end of the book, Mason and Dixon do have this realization. They've been kind of dancing around it throughout the book. And they, should we be drawing this line? What does it mean? Why are we doing it? Why do the powers that be want this line drawn? And they have this conversation toward the end of the book that I've always found quite powerful, where, everywhere they've sent us, says Dixon, Cape Town, St. Helena, America, what's the element common to all? Slaves, he says. Every day at the Cape, we lived with slavery in our faces. And now here we are again in another colony, this time having drawn in a line between their slave keepers and their wage payers, as if doomed to re-encounter through the world this public secret, this shameful core, passing daily into the hands of slave owners and torturers, but never in Holland, nor in England, that garden of fools. Christ, Mason, he says, right? He's waking up to the fact that this stuff is everywhere. Christ what, says Mason? What did I do? Us, says Dixon. Didn't we take the king's money as we're taking it again, while slaves waited upon us, and neither one objected, as little as we have here in certain houses south of the line? Where does it end? No matter where in it we go, shall we find all the world tyrants and slaves? America was the one place we should not have found them. So they had this moment of realization. Pynchon's never going to say, good job, Dixon. Good job, Mason. He's always going to combine it with their own complicity. Never going to give you an answer that says they've changed. And he doesn't. Look what Mason's response is. Yeah, we're just hirelings, Dixon, he says. And Dixon says, I don't trust this king, Mason. I don't think anybody else does either. They execute their own. What might they be willing to do to us? They're afraid to resist in a certain way. They're afraid to resist the order of the day. And that's something that I think Pynchon points out. And he's also trying to sort of move these characters to finding joy in something other than their work, in their family, to seek ways to work outside of the main channels of power and authority. For all his skepticism about institutions, especially in his later work, Pynchon is optimistic about family. Some of the most soaring sections of this book are Mason with his young sons. And that's something that Pynchon writes about, I think, quite well. Why is this the best book ever for me? I think it's prescient in a lot of ways. It anticipates our debates about history, especially how we teach it, in a way that's quite powerful. I think it also suggests throughout the book, it paints a picture of the American Revolution as a group of elites, like Franklin and Washington, capitalizing on public anger for economic gain. He doesn't see it as an argument about freedom. He sees it as an attempt by these people in power to take anger against the elites and manage it and orchestrate it according to their causes. There's lots of discourse about that now. I don't think you get American politics today without a lot of anti-elite sentiment. That's something that gets brought up over and over and over again. It's one of the sort of driving engines of our biggest partisan battles. Pynchon's right on that. I mean, he's right on that. Throughout it all, it never loses sight of Mason and Dixon's buddy movie relationship. I mean, as serious as it is, there are parts of this book that are a buddy movie. Mason and Dixon go to taverns. Dixon comforts Mason as he grieves for his past deceased wife. Dixon tries to pick up women. They pass around food. They do all the things in sort of a camaraderie way that we would expect from friends, and in a way that's very human. And that I think is something that comes throughout the book. So I think this is a really powerful illustration of both some of the problems with history, some of the hard parts about being human in a world that you can't control, but also giving you a little bit of medicine to help you deal with it. I don't know if anybody's heard of this book, Ducks Newberry Report. This is a book by Lucy Ellman. It is 900 or so pages of a single sentence. That's overly simplistic, right? That's like the sales pitch. But it's written in stream of consciousness style. It is written from the perspective of a nameless woman who lives in Newcomerstown, Ohio. She is a mom, a sometimes adjunct instructor, because when you're an adjunct, it's always sometimes an adjunct, instructor at a local college, and she bakes on the side. So she keeps chickens because she needs the eggs, because she produces these baked goods for local restaurants. And the book is just an immersion into her mind. And what she's worried about is her family's safety. That just animates everything. She's terrified that her family's going to get shot every day because of the sort of violence of America. And she lives at this town, Newcomerstown, which is the site of another famous massacre of Native Americans. And so in a way, these books are like weirdly together, even though they're very different. Both have characters who are sort of wondering about their role in the grand scheme. And what I love about both of these books is the way that I think Ellman has been very critical. I think she actually emigrated to Canada, so she's been critical of the American project. She's angry. Both of these books see a lot of the ugliness in America and American history. They are serious about the need for correction, meaning, and humor. They are very distrustful of power and institutions, but they never really resort to cynicism or resigned fatalism. They always insist that beauty exists. It's just in the places we haven't been taught to look. And that's why when you read most of the heroes in Pynchon tend to be drunk guys with guitars. People that are far outside the bounds of power and authority. Pynchon once said that, working rock and roll band is the one true miracle, right? So that's his faith. I think Ellman sort of shares a similar faith in family and its power. For all the fear in this book, the family it depicts is a very loving family despite their issues, and that never wavers. The side story in Ducks Newberry Report is about a lioness whose cubs go missing, like an actual lioness, and it follows her journey to find them. And it suggests that that's where you have to find meaning in those moments, because the other stuff will never be touched by you. And while I find that discouraging on some level, I find it meaningful on another. And I think that is why this is the best book ever. This is a close second. So thank you very much for listening. I would love to hear questions, thoughts, concerns. Yeah, go ahead.
You might have already mentioned this, and I must have missed it. Who introduced you to Thomas Pynchon?
That is a good question. I didn't mention it. I first read Pynchon as an undergrad in 2006. My teacher, his name is Scott Richardson, and the first book we read was called V. It was called V. That's Pynchon's first novel. He introduced me, and I was just immediately taken with that book. I just thought it was one of the most compelling things I'd ever read. It was very different. I never read anybody that had been doing that kind of writing before.
Was it also historical and dealt with?
Yeah, so V takes place in 1950s New York. There's one plot that takes place in 50s New York. There's another part that sort of spans the 20th century. And so it goes from 1898 to World War II. And it focuses a lot on colonialism. The centerpiece of V, Pynchon in V uses something called the Herero massacre. This is in German Southwest Africa, modern day Namibia. There was a period where A general by the name of von Trotha killed something like 60,000 native Herero in the struggle for control. And that sort of forms the centerpiece of parts of the book. And Pynchon has a line there which I think captures his kind of approach to history. He saw that as a dress rehearsal for the Holocaust. Right? He said, 60,000 is 1% of 6 million, but still not bad, right? And I think that captures his sort of cynicism in certain ways, his anger in certain ways, and also his conception of history, right? He doesn't see sort of World War II as an aberration, right? Like he doesn't see it as a power mad Adolf Hitler, right? Seizing control of things. He sees it as part of a long history of oppression, subjugation, and violence. And it's only a matter of time before that takes over. I mean, he's also writing in '63, right? Where, Khrushchev has his finger on the button, and so does Kennedy, right? So he's concerned about the sort of violent arc of history.
So, I'm sorry. So when, so it's touched you in that way. So are your classes built around that notion, and then do you push the envelope with your students? What's next, and those are your assignments in your class, or what?
I always try to fully represent every author I'm teaching. I don't actually teach Pynchon very much because I teach creative writing. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about some really difficult subject matter in my classes, right? But most of them are about aesthetics, and sometimes as the semester goes along, especially, we'll have the moral dimension of aesthetics, right? Because Pynchon is definitely an author who wants to write compelling stories, but he's got an expressed political ideology that comes through in the book, right? And there are ways to do that I think all writing is political, and it's worth acknowledging that. There are ways to write about politics that make more sense or that work better aesthetically, and there are ways that don't work quite as well. And so in class, we're often talking about that, right? Like, how do you write deeply about politics without coming off as preachy or a partisan hack, or without making people too mad that they don't want to keep reading, right? And I think Pynchon has a big advantage because he's writing about 1762, at least in this book, right? It's harder to do that if you're writing about an audience that's with a topic that's more charged. But we definitely talk about it all the time. Yeah, I don't get to teach Pynchon very much. Yeah, go ahead.
Is Pynchon saying that there really is no difference between history and fiction? I mean, his books combine the two, right?
I think he would say fiction is a form of history. Right? Not that there's no difference between them, but that fiction is a form of history, and history is a form of fiction. And that you need both. Sam, does that help a little bit? Maybe not. I mean, and I think it's it's a provocative statement in a lot of ways, right? He's writing it in the 60s at a time when there's a questioning of history, right? So he's writing, a lot of his books are coming out at the height of sort of Vietnam and the protest movement. Pynchon later grows pretty disillusioned with the counterculture of the 60s and writes critically about it. But yeah, I mean, he's arising out of a tradition that's super, super skeptical of history with a capital H, right? If anybody's familiar with Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, which is a book, sort of a history written from the perspective of various oppressed groups of people. Pynchon is more in line with that vision, probably. I think he would probably say that all fiction has traces of history, and all history has traces of fiction. That might be the pithy way to put it. Other thoughts, other questions? Yeah, please.
You said you were you joined your graduate work at St. John's?
Yeah.
At that St. John's, did they do it the same way they did it in Santa Fe and in Maryland?
Different.
Yeah.
I love that model though, the great books model. Yeah. The St. John's in New Mexico and Maryland they have a program where the whole educational model is just you read books, the great books. I didn't get that. Mine's different. My St. John's is most famous for the winningest college football coach in history, named John Gallardi. Never hit in practice.
That's right.
Yep.
And I was deficient in my introduction. We challenged faculty members to take one of the books off that list that Amy mentioned, the greatest books ever. But then we also said, please introduce a book that should be on the list. So I'm grateful you chose the second one.
Yeah.
And what strikes me about your description of it is this tension that the family's going to be shot.
Yeah.
Which I think many of us, we've touched that.
Yeah.
But to have it be overriding through the whole thing, what sorts of themes do you see, because you're teaching writing, among your students that surprise you? They're of a different generation than you, and we as readers might be a different generation from you and your students. But what are some of the themes you're seeing in the writing that speak to a spirit of the times?
That's a good question. Probably the easiest thing is just they're much more facile with being able to incorporate technology, like text messages as part of dialogue, for example. Like Raymond Carver, 1970s minimalism, it would have been phone calls, right? Like dialogue is delivered over the phone. Here it's delivered on screens. They're pretty good about that. I mean, I think that's a thing. One of the hard parts is that, like, because of the way that, like, entertainment and narrative economy works, like Netflix and Hulu, they're all watching the same stuff. And so a lot of the stuff that I get tries to pull from the stuff that they're watching. And that stuff hasn't changed all that much, right? like even though Netflix offers a lot of opportunities, it's still a lot of stuff about serial killers or police procedurals. And there are ways to do that, I think, really, really well, and sometimes my students do it. I'm always surprised. The thing that I think I notice more about writing that speaks to the spirit of the time is just like plot. Like students they want plot. They want things to happen in their story. Whereas sort of the stuff that I was reading in my creative writing program is much more about character. So like a lot of the story happens in quiet moments. Like, you put your character in a room and they have a small conflict with somebody, or they go to order a coffee, right? And the great writers are able to make that a meaningful interaction. And that's really hard for students, I think. And I think they just get a lot of action. It's action all the time. But I'm always surprised, and I think they always sometimes will just blindside you with a brilliant observation about like what it's like. And I usually have to tell them, like, okay, this story needs like way less plot. like this character needs to go to three fewer locations and have only one of these things happen to them. And then your story's interesting. Right? They're often creating really compelling, like, complex characters who are, either like multiracial or from a different class background, or they write very openly about traumas they've experienced, whether it's assault or something else. They're able to capture, I think, a different kind of experience than other people. I definitely see that. And I guess you asked about the getting shot. They sometimes write about that too, that fear. The best of those stories are about the fear rather than the experience, if that makes sense.
Is this his last book?
No. So this is his fifth book, I think. So he's got a book after the book after this is called Against the Day. It takes place from 1893, World's Fair, till just after World War I. Similar themes, very similar themes. It's 1,000 pages. And then there's a book called Inherent Vice, which you may have heard of the movie. Joaquin Phoenix is in it. And then, which is kind of a detective story. It's a lot like The Big Lebowski, if you've seen that movie. So a little bit more fun movie. And then his latest book is 2013. It's called Bleeding Edge. It takes place from spring 2001 until just after. It's his 9/11 novel. So just after the 9/11 attacks. Yeah.
I'd just like to say thank you for the lecture today.
Thanks for coming.
And when I think of Pynchon as a writer, I kind of think of Kurt Vonnegut.
Yeah.
With him, and
Yeah.
would you say that they would be kind of looking at things in a similar way, especially Slaughterhouse-Five, right?
Absolutely. And Cat's Cradle, if you've read Cat's Cradle, it's the book about they create this compound called Ice-9, and it turns all the water into ice. It's about sort of the dangers of science, right? And the way that it gets weaponized. I think that book is very much in line with Gravity's Rainbow. Like the thing that Pynchon writes about almost more than anything else, and he writes about, he's written thousands and thousands of pages, but the thing that he writes about more than anything else is the military-industrial complex. And and the way that science and technology get weaponized and how that's sort of the whole idea, right? And even in this book, right? Charles Mason is an astronomer looking at the stars, right? But like the East India Company literally can't do their business without him, right? Like his technology enables them to enslave people and export their goods and sell them, you know, put them on ships and get them there safely. Because without it, they're going to crash on the rocks. They don't know where they are. And I mean, that's a major theme for Pynchon, is the way that technology feeds into violence. at a certain dark, but the thing that makes it, I think, fun to read is the moments of lightness. Despite all that darkness, there's a kind of clinging to hope there, or at least a clinging to jokes, which is maybe enough. I don't know if it is. Sometimes it feels like barely enough. Others.
Well, did you have a question? I wasn't sure if you were about to ask a question.
Did you ever see the series on the History Channel that was called Mankind, the History of Us?
I think I have seen that.
And the thing that I noticed all through this series was the different ways that people through the ages oppressed each other to get what they wanted.
Yep.
I mean, the image that made such an impression on me was when they catapulted over these diseased bodies in the area where their enemy was. You know, it just it kind of makes you wonder about people's values.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really useful comparison, and it's right in line. And I think in this book, it's not a person's values, right? It's the values that people get pushed on them by the currents of the day, right? By the things that make sense, right? And I think that's part of what keeps it from getting too dark, is that there is some faith in individuals. But you're right. I mean, the scope of it is quite dark. And it's hard to think about.
Well, I know that conversations can continue for a little while if you'd like to hang out here. We want to put in a pitch before we go too much further, that next Tuesday we're going to wrap up the series. Another of our non-English department faculty, Lucas Street, who's in our Reading and Writing Center. So we started with an English prof, a classicist, creative writing. We'll close up in the Reading and Writing Center. He's going to talk about Marilyn Robinson's Gilead. So I hope you'll join us then. I do want to point out that there was an Augustana professor who had a very special relationship with William Styron, and that culminated in Styron coming to our community, as many of you might remember. And so who knows, Brett? Maybe you cultivate this relationship and you'll be the one to get Pynchon out of his shell, and maybe he'll come here to Augustana.
No, people would come to that.
Oh, absolutely.
From Italy.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like that would be like if he showed up, that would be like the depth of passion people have.
Then let's have coffee and work on it.
Yeah, okay.
But until then, would you please join me in thanking our presenter today, Brett Biebel.